Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder. This is World Review, a weekly look at news from around the world, produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It is Friday, October 6th. Here's what's on tap this week. First, we'll take a look at Ukraine and see whether Western support is starting to dwindle, with a big debate in the U.S. Congress on whether to continue funding Ukraine, and elections and political changes in Europe that are raising similar questions. Then we'll take a look at a crisis that seems to be escalating in the Balkans. Serbia deployed military troops on the border of Kosovo after a significant incident inside Kosovo itself. Is this the next crisis in Europe? And finally, Canada and India remain at loggerheads and are digging in deeper with expulsion of diplomats by both sides, and no sense that either of the countries is willing to find a way out of what was a remarkable event when Indian forces have been accused of assassinating a Canadian citizen of Sikh origin. Here to talk about all of these issues are Carla Robbins, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and formerly of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, Steven Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe from the United States, and Philip Stevens, Contributing Editor to the Financial Times. Morning all, great to see you. Wonderful to have you back on the show. Carla, let's start with you. Really a huge debate emerging in the United States about not just the dysfunction of the U.S. House, where for the first time in the history, the Speaker was ousted, but a very big worry that perhaps one of the real victims here is funding for Ukraine. Where do you see this debate? Well, first of all, just bring us up to date about where we are on this debate, and secondly, where do you think this is going?
Well, I've been trying to figure out the alternatives that Biden has. When Zelensky came, he said, "If I don't get the money, I'm going to lose," and I think he's a pretty persuasive argument there. So let's start with the public attitudes. Ivo, your people just came out with a poll. And all the polls, they aren't exactly the same, but all polls show a decline in enthusiasm for supporting Ukraine. But when you think about it, that's not really very surprising. Americans notoriously have a very short attention span. And wars are not glamorous. And everybody was very excited in the early days. Look, David taking on Goliath. But even, your poll says 63% of U.S. adults still support providing additional arms and military supply to Ukrainian government. Biggest drop among the Republicans. There's a Reuters Ipsos poll that came out this week that asked whether people agreed with the statement that Washington, quote, should provide weapons to Ukraine, and found that 41% of respondents were in agreement compared to 35%. So all over the lot. But, I don't take the polls all that seriously, because you don't ask people salience. Are you going to go out in the streets and demonstrate against it? Is this an issue you're going to vote on? Support declines. I think it has a lot more to do with leadership and what the politicians are willing to do or not do. I think the biggest question here is how much is this caught up in the leadership fight in the House, and how much Biden can actually push it ahead with Congress. As we all know, they stripped the aid out of the continuing resolution. McCarthy was ousted. He was not a big supporter of Ukraine in the first place. And the two guys who are up for it and battling right now over it, Jim Jordan, is campaigning on no aid for Ukraine. And Scalise, who's the majority leader, has voted consistently for Ukraine aid, but he's never said much about it. And he could be forced into a corner and say, well, to get all the support that he wants, that he's going to come out against the aid as well. Which then raises the question, is there a way for them to maneuver the aid? Because it's absolutely essential that they do it. And what are the choices? There's some maneuvering if you believe that a majority of House members will vote for it, which isn't a hard thing to believe because most Democrats will vote for it. They have a very slim, difference between Democrats and Republicans in the House. So they can, there is a maneuver to get something on the floor, so they could do this discharge petition. The administration, meanwhile, is trying to figure out the politics of this, and they're also like shaking the sofa cushions, looking for borders and searching for other pots of money. Biden said on Wednesday that he's going to give a major speech for public support, but he also hinted, that there was, quote, another means of funding. And I've been talking to people and trying to figure out what he means by that. They one time was they were transferred these seized weapons from, 1 million rounds of ammunition from Iran. I suspect there's a reasonable amount of stuff lying around that they can give for a while. Creative accounting might do them some good. If you recall, a few months ago, the Pentagon suddenly said, oh, actually, we really overvalued some of the stuff we gave to Ukraine, and there's another $6.2 billion, of which there's now $5.4 billion left that they can still draw down. And if you recall, that was the $6 billion that they wanted to get into this. So I think they've got a little bit more room to maneuver. Congress gave Biden Lend-Lease authority last year that does expire, I think, but maybe there's some way to extend it. So I think, I suspect even as they think about how Biden can get up and give a rousing speech that pushes back against these polls, I think they're looking for creative ways to fund this.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I don't see them giving up on this anytime soon, given the stakes that are there. But there is, it sends Steve signals back to Europe, and I thought that Europe seems to be all a jitter. That this is just the first step towards America's retreat, not just from Ukraine, but probably from the world, given what's happening in the politics here. So tell us a little bit about what you hear about European attitudes. And then also, of course, we had a big election in Slovakia. Not that Slovakia is the core of the support for Ukraine, but it's a neighbor. It's an important logistical place, and there the winning party ran against funding for Ukraine and on a sort of pro or certainly not anti-Russian platform.
Well, you're right. There is a lot of jittering. I just came back to Berlin from Warsaw, where there was a security forum, and there's a lot more anxiety about Republicans in Congress than there are about the Slovaks. Because U.S. aid really is critical. Josep Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, basically said yesterday, Europe can't make up the difference, certainly not in terms of military aid. So there is this worry that we've reached peak Ukraine, and support for Ukraine will never again be as big as it was 6 months ago. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to disappear. And there's a general view that the Americans will somehow figure out a way to keep the aid flowing. But another $43 billion seems out of touch. And you combine that with the use of Ukraine in domestic politics, not just in Slovakia, which is a tiny country. I mean, Fico, who came back mostly, let's be honest, on local issues, this is under 500,000 votes the guy got. He got 23% of the vote in a small country, and it's not even clear he's going to end up prime minister. There's an election in Poland next week, the first round, that really does matter because Poland's big and it neighbors Ukraine. And Ukraine has become one of the instrumentalized victims in this bitter, nasty internal Polish election campaign. It really is quite extraordinary. I mean, the governing coalition, which feels itself in trouble, wants a third term, Law and Justice, is portraying the opposition leader, Donald Tusk, as a vassal of both Moscow and Berlin at the same time. And so being attacked itself for being too weak on its Ukraine policy by allowing too much Ukrainian grain into Poland to hurt Polish farmers. So you get all this wrapped up, and you see it in Germany too. Ukraine becomes a domestic political instrument, and this is quite bitter. So again, public opinion is pretty much supporting, more for Ukraine, but people are tired of it, and they're tired of the war, and it is expensive. And even Rob Bauer, who's head of NATO's military committee, said in Warsaw, we're looking at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to ammunition supplies. So this is an important moment, I think, and the Ukrainians are feeling a little gloomy about it, I would say.
Philip, this is a pretty gloomy picture that that Steve and Carla are painting here, in the sense that support in the United States and support in Europe seems to be challenged, and this is not what the Ukrainians either want to hear or, frankly, what they need. They need as much support as possible, particularly given that they are sort of in a war of attrition in which mass and major ammunition is what's going to lead to the breakthrough that they're seeking.
Yeah, I think it's striking. There is this weariness. We saw President Zelensky at a European conference in Spain this week, making the obvious point that if we weren't fighting the Russians would be fighting you, probably, and in the sense. And if you talk privately to most European politicians and diplomats, they agree. They say this is Europe's fight. This isn't just Ukraine's. At the same time, they then say, well, but this is where I get personally sort of deeply frustrated with European policy, because while they bleat about, maybe the Americans won't be providing more, they then hesitate themselves. And we've seen this again with Scholz saying, oh, we don't want to give too sophisticated weaponry to Ukraine in case it escalates or draws us in. You also get, I think, this sense of the Europeans are saying, look, we're running out of ammunition, but they're not putting in the orders with business, with industry, to replenish the stock. So there's quite a lot that Europeans could do before they start, I think, complaining about the US. There's no crunch point in Europe at the moment. There's no point at which, as there is potentially in the Congress over Ukraine, and in places like the UK, it's a completely bipartisan consensus to keep supporting Ukraine. I think one of the problems in Europe has got nothing to do with Ukraine, and it's the fact that the Franco-German relationship is going through one of its periodic sort of down trends. And so the whole, the machinery isn't working terribly well. And if, the French and the Germans are disagreeing about a new fighter aircraft and a new tank and various other things. So there isn't any positive energy impetus going into Ukraine. But I don't think we're at a crisis point. But I do think that, basically Europe, it's time for Europeans to stop worrying so much about what Biden may do or what the Congress may do, and focus a little more on what we can do and should do.
Yeah, and in many ways, Philip, that argument would strengthen the argument for people in the United States to say, listen, Europe is doing its part. We need to do our part. Europe has done a significant amount. About half of the total financial support, including military, comes from Europe, and close to half of all military support. So it's not like nothing is happening, but it would help. I agree. And Carla, just to finish up here, if you can't find another pot of money, and it looks like the pots of money they may be able to find wouldn't be the 60+ billion that Lindsey Graham is talking about for that is in some ways he's seeking for the coming year to get us through the U.S. National election. How do you see this one playing out? How do you get from here to where we need to go?
Well, I think this is absolutely essential for Biden. I think that I don't know if a speech is going to make a difference, but I think this is very much caught up with what he's going to run on for, if he does run, which everyone thinks he will. I mean, this whole notion that has to go back to being the uniter. The notion that this is a dysfunctional Republican Party and that this is Ukraine is an existential, survival issue for the West, and the country itself is existentially threatened. And that's certainly the way people talk about it in Washington. They see the possibility of weaving these two messages together. Biden's never been a great speaker. We haven't seen a lot of speeches out of him because they've tried to restrain him, but not just because he's the gaffes. It's also because as he gets older, let's face it, he stumbles over his words. But they need a ringing speech. And I think that the way he intuitively gets Ukraine, I think he intuitively understands that these two things really fit together and they're intrinsic to his own reelection, which is that if the country can't pull together on something as basic as this, the country can't pull together. So I think that's probably the pitch that we're going to hear. And I think there are enough people in Congress who want to do it. It's really just getting past this. And I think in the Senate, there is an enormous amount of support, but they got really, really freaked out by the House when the House, said to them, are you going to put a shutdown for Ukraine? There wasn't a lot of courage up there either. So I think it's really going to come down to Biden. And I don't know whether Biden can pull that off.
Well, we'll be watching it closely. I think if you need a part-time job as speechwriter, Carla, I think the White House might be calling you to try to put that one together. I think it's working really well. But let's see where it goes. I tend to be optimistic about this too. In some ways, the government needs to be funded at some point. There's going to be a do or die vote. And they'll stuff it full with Ukraine money as they did it in previous times, and then the Senate and the majority in the House will move forward. So I'm actually pretty optimistic, and I find it may be useful to have this kind of jitteriness in both the U.S. And in Europe to increase the temperature, but whether it actually is based on a real fear, I'm not sure. But we'll see. Steve. Let's move on to a crisis that well, having reported during the Kosovo War from the ground at the time, but all of a sudden, maybe not all of a sudden, but all of a sudden, significant escalation yet again between Serbia and Kosovo, and then this really worrisome report that the U.S. Released releasing early intelligence that normally would have not been released, but publicly releasing intelligence of major concentrations of Serb forces on the Kosovo border. It looked like over the weekend that this might go really, really bad. It now seems to be a little less bad. But tell us a little bit, bring us up to date. What is the conflict here? Why are we even talking about this? And where do you see this going?
Well, it's more like, where do I start? I mean, 1999.
Yeah.
No, 1382.
Even further, right?
The Field of Blackbirds.
Right.
But the war, 1999, didn't really finish, right? I mean, what happened was NATO marched in. It was never had a UN Security Council backing. The Serbs left Kosovo, but not all of Kosovo. And Kosovo, which was a province of Serbia, declared independence with American support and the support of most countries, but not Russia, not Spain, not countries that had internal divisions themselves, didn't want borders changed. And then KFOR, which was the NATO force that was supposed to police the aftermath, failed in its mission. I mean, the French allowed Serbs to take over northern Kosovo, and they have taken over northern Kosovo. They remain strong in northern Kosovo. They use the Serbian dinar. They listen to Belgrade. They won't use Kosovar license plates. And yet, the EU and the US have been trying ever since to get Serbia and Kosovo leaders to settle this. It's been nasty. I don't think the Serbs will ever want to settle it because they don't ever want Kosovo as an independent state. And in the meantime, Alexander Vučić, president of Serbia, has probably more power than Milosevic ever did. And he toys with nationalism in very similar ways. The Albanian leader, Albin Kurti, is an old KLA supporter, very articulate, but is fed up with this country that he has, which is basically partly occupied by Serbia. And KFOR does very little about it. So what you had is there's a fight over, whether Serbian municipalities, Serbian majority municipalities should have some separate league, and in return for this and that and the other thing, minor things. But you have a very kind of Serb criminal paramilitary group that attacked Kosovar policemen, killed one of them, and then the Kosovar responded and found in a monastery huge amounts of weapons that were Serb weapons. Vučić denies having anything to do with it, but nobody believes that, frankly, because there are a lot of big weapons. And then in the meantime, KFOR's tried to move including with some extra British troops, to try to keep things calm. And then we discover, much as you said, Ivo, that the Serbs put like 5,000 troops with heavy equipment on the border. Now, Vučić says, "Oh, I didn't mean to do anything," but this is very strange. So one wondered whether, like the Azeris taking Nagorno-Karabakh, the Serbs thought they could use everyone's distraction to put pressure on Kurti. Very hard to know, but I do think at long last, NATO KFOR has responded and things are calming down. But the solution to this is nowhere in sight.
So I mean, in some ways, the match was that was about to light the whole heap up was snuffed out in time, Philip. But it and not only British troops. I think, Steve. I think the Germans also sent some troops as well. But there is this fundamental question of how do you move forward here, even though we didn't have what looked like the possibility of a severe escalation with Serbian troops moving into Kosovo, in some ways called out by the release of intelligence. But Philip, how do you see this moving forward? Is there a way in which the international community can sort of accelerate an attempt to find a durable solution, or are we just going to be living like this as we frankly have for the past 25 years almost now?
Well, I think one of the things you hear from Europeans is well, we don't have the bandwidth. We have Ukraine, and we can't deal with the Balkans and Ukraine. But the two, in a curious way, are linked, because one of the things here is that Putin is encouraging the Serbs, quite likes the idea of this destabilizing parcel of land in the middle of the Balkans, makes NATO uncomfortable, makes the EU uncomfortable, puts all these questions about the extension of the EU to the Western Balkans. So, if you like, Serbia isn't going to break with Putin. Putin is, if you like, encouraging, if not igniting, or encouraging the escalation there. And it's very difficult to see with Russia in that position, NATO putting in, sufficient forces to, if you like, face up to the Serbs. So it's sad to say this is, I think we're gonna be here for quite a while, and probably until, it's probably insoluble until we get in sight of some resolution in Ukraine.
Insoluble, Carla, until there's a resolution in Ukraine, in the sense that Putin will be put at such a disadvantage that we can actually try to influence other actors in Serbia. Is that kind of how you see it? And what do you hear in Washington in terms of their concern? Looks like Carla's kind of having a little bit of internet problems here.
Well, I'm so sorry about that. I wish I could say that I was in some really exotic place that has terrible internet, and I'm in the heart of New York City. So
that's the problem.
That's pretty exotic. Just to
Steve, go ahead.
While she's getting back again, one of the things that's interesting, as Philip says, is the relationship of this conflict with Ukraine, because one being so indulgent of Vučić is because he has been willing to supply Russian caliber ammunition to Ukraine. I mean, because they need Russian caliber ammunition too. So he's, as always, kind of playing both sides against one another. He hasn't agreed to do sanctions on Russia, even though he wants to be a candidate member for the European Union. Toria Nuland once told me about Vučić that he has a little angel on one shoulder and a big devil on the other shoulder, and we're trying to feed the angel. We've been trying to feed the angel for a long time now, and he's a big guy, Vučić, but the angel doesn't seem much bigger, I have to say.
Yeah, no, he is. In the meantime, Philip, the Albanian, which were standing on the sideline, they're of course a member of NATO, but not of the European Union. They're a candidate. The Albanian prime minister came out pretty strong, saying that it was time for the European Union and NATO to really start taking this much more seriously than they had.
He got some response from NATO with the extra troops. The EU, as you know, Steve said, we've got countries like Spain that still refuse to, because of Catalonia, and so it's very difficult to see how you need, I think, at least the Russians to be outside of the game, as it were, not necessarily supportive of any settlement, but to one side. Otherwise, it's really difficult. That, as Steve said, which is going to play both sides. He does a bit for Ukraine, but he keeps very much on side with the Kremlin. So I don't see the dynamic, if you like, that gives you a settlement. And I don't think Kosovo can do anything. I don't think Albania of itself can actually do anything.
Yeah, and it doesn't look like the European Union and NATO and the United States are willing to do more than the least to keep the matter under control. Carla, I think you're back. You're muted. So I want to. You're muted, Carla.
I'll just keep on coming today. Okay.
Yeah, no. Okay. So just a final word. There was this that I'd love to get your perspective on. There was this very deliberate attempt by the White House to once again downgrade intelligence in order to influence diplomatic steps, just as it tried and failed with regard to Ukraine to deter the Russians. It seems to at least have had the effect of preventing Serbia from thinking they could get away with it by publicizing it. Is this the new way in which you think diplomacy is going to use the intelligence resources we have? It used to be that this was only leaked to folks like you, but now it comes from the White House podium.
Well, I think this is an extraordinary thing, and I give full credit to Bill Burns for this, the Director of Central Intelligence, and the White House trusts him completely. And he, as a longtime consumer of intelligence from being in Russia and being in the State Department, he made a very persuasive argument in the beginning of the Ukraine war that this was the best way to prevent false flag operations. And I think the agency, which of course, you could be standing in front of a clock and they wouldn't tell you the time of day because they tell you it was a threat to sources and methods. The agency was so downtrodden during the Trump administration that suddenly they had a champion. They felt like they were back in, and you weren't hearing screams of pain from, the professional intel people. They loved having him there. So I think the dynamic right now is this very careful use of intelligence, but that it's been a quite effective tool. Will it continue in another administration with a different DCI? I don't know, but I think that, it's certainly a new form of the use of intelligence itself. But I give credit to particularly Burns and the fact that there's such a strong relationship between Burns and the White House.
Very interesting. I think I think you got that exactly right. And to be fair, I think Avril Haines as the DNI is certainly fully supportive on it. But the Burns, particular Burns relationship, and as of such a long time consumer of intelligence, as a former senior State Department official, makes a lot of sense. And I think it is very significant. We should not underestimate that if you call people out and have real evidence to do it. It will have an impact. Speaking of intelligence, Philip, U.S. intelligence seems to have fully bought into the Canadian argument that it was the Indian government that was behind the assassination of a Sikh leader, a Canadian citizen in British Columbia a few months ago, and that crisis, which in some ways you would have expected between Canada and India, not really, certainly the Canadians seen as a very belligerent player. You would have expected this thing to be resolved in some way. It doesn't seem that that's happening. Both sides are digging in deeper. I think the Indians even more. The Canadians are responding. But how do you see it? And where do you think this is heading?
Well, it is very interesting because, as you say, you're talking about intelligence and calling people out. Well, as you know, it's been said, and I don't have proof, but it's been said, and the Canadians haven't pushed back against this, that the intelligence that led them to believe the Indian state were implicated, heavily implicated in the murder of this Sikh separatist leader, Hardeep Singh Nijjar. The US provided the intelligence, but is really not calling out the Indian government. Now, I think, if you look at Justin Trudeau's position, if you have a citizen of your country murdered on your soil by a foreign state, you have to call it out. If you've got decent intelligence, and some of which at least came from the US. And I have not heard anyone in Europe suggest that maybe the Canadians have got this wrong. It seems to be accepted that the Indian state, whether how far the decision making went to the top is another question, but the Indian state is heavily implicated. Now, I think there are two prisms for this story. There's the narrow prism, which everyone is trying to stick to, is that it's a bilateral argument between Canada and India, although President Biden and some European leaders are supposed to have talked privately to Mr. Modi to say, look, we're concerned about this, but basically, let's not make this an international spat. Now, the Indians, of course, are very concerned because they don't want to be put in the same box that Saudi Arabia was put in after the killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi a few years ago. India doesn't want to be put in that box, and that's why it's reacted very strongly. But the second sort of prism, the broader prism, is that, this is going to be a problem. I mean, as much as Western nations are all courting Modi and India is a democracy, it's quite obvious that the present government, particularly in its attitude towards opponents of the regime, which they call extremists and terrorists or whatever, doesn't share general Western norms. Now, there is a question here for all governments, not just the Canadians. If we get to a situation, everyone needs India. America needs it against China in particular as part of its Asian Pacific strategy. But how far do you let these nations go? Do you say, as we do with Turkey, well, look, we'll just, basically ignore in some respects, or most obviously with Saudi Arabia, we'll ignore the fact that they don't share our norms and that they do these things? Or do you say at some point you have to push back? At the moment, I think it's a pity that Western governments, the US and European governments, are unwilling to to say to the Indians, at least, okay, let's have you've got to institute a clear inquiry into this, an investigation that's transparent. But at the moment, Mr. Modi holds the cards. I think the Canadians I think Justin Trudeau had no alternative but to call it out. I think they are working diplomatically now to try and at least diffuse, lower the situation or lower the temperature. But I think a bit of support from the rest of from Canada's allies might be useful here. And and I think I don't think that the US or Britain, for that matter, or Germany and France could just opt out when our friends and allies step outside the norm so so obviously and gratuitously, as it were.
Yeah, I think Steve, that it strikes me this broader prism that we always have the sort of the realpolitik versus our values conundrum. We've had it with Saudi Arabia in spades, but in the India case, it's even stronger because it is a putative democracy, and if you let democracies get away with this, what happens? How do you even deal with this issue? You raised Poland before as another. Of course, no assassinations there other than of character, which is not unimportant in a political sense. But yeah, we in our own country, in the United States, we have a leading candidate who is threatening violence all over the place. It is something that is deeper and ought to unite the democracies in perhaps a stronger voice. How do you think about it?
Well, I think Philip gave a terrific summary. I'm just very struck by the lack of reaction in the Western world compared to the killing of Khashoggi or of Skripal in Britain, when the whole world, united, and they threw out all these Russian diplomats from the EU and NATO, and even Trump threw out Russian diplomats. And so is this really very, very different? I mean, it's a serious question. I mean, Germany's dealing with this thing too, because there's a Russian agent who's been convicted of murdering a Chechen dissident in Germany. And the suspicion is that Russia took this poor Wall Street Journal reporter, Evan Gershkovich, and wants to trade him, once he's convicted, for this Russian in Germany. So, I mean, you have the issue of hostage, but you also have, Ivo, as you said, I mean, where is the solidarity? I mean, Canada has to defend the rights of its citizens to speak freely and to live their lives. And if India really is culpable, which it seems to be, there should be more Western reaction, despite Modi's blustering. I mean, we need India, but we don't want to suddenly sanction the murder of our citizens whenever some authoritarian leader decides that they're troublesome.
Carla, how in the U.S. and in the Biden administration, which has trumpeted human rights as a focal point of its foreign policy, also trumpeted the relationship with India as a focal of its Indo-Pacific policy. They're collapsing right now, right?
And fist bumps in Saudi Arabia. Yes, okay.
And fist bump, exactly. I mean, it's a tough, but this is, in contrast to the Europeans, it's a NATO ally, and this is our neighbor. When it comes to the U.S., you thought a little bit more sympathy, and I can't believe that in Canada they're not particularly worried about this, but they must be struggling with this in the White House. So,
as Philip said, I mean, we have this incredibly close intelligence sharing in the Five Eyes, and which the Canadians and the Brits, are part of. And there's much to the frustration, often to the Germans and the French, that we share more with them than we do with countries with which we have other stronger military relationships. And so we knew what they knew, and they knew what we knew. And I was absolutely amazed that we heard not a peep out of the U.S. for the longest, time. And we have been enabling Modi and enabling Erdogan. Erdogan comes out and says, I actually sort of equally trust Putin and the United States. And there's no reaction. And this thing now with Modi, I mean, I'm totally with you, with Steve, with Philip on this, that this is just utterly unacceptable. But I will make one historical point here. the U.S. had to be dragged under the Trump administration into denouncing Saudi Arabia after the Khashoggi murder. I mean, let's not face it, and boxed in part by the intelligence community, if you recall. This is the classic sort of Trump. Intelligence community says, but I also know what I know. So this stuff doesn't inevitably happen quickly, but we're enabling Modi, and we're enabling Modi in a political context in which I fear things are only going to get worse because they're. So I think this is bad. I think it's bad for a relationship with Canada, and I think it's bad for India. And I, if I were still thundering on the editorial page, I think the headline would be bad, 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 bad.
Very good headline. That would really that would get there, get people's attention. But
frequently,
Philip, I think the way you rightly this wider prism put it, and maybe we can end on this set of issues. We've now talked what happened in Poland. We know what's happening in the United States, where the president of the former president of the United States calls for killing the former chairman of chiefs of staff. The assassination of it. You have in Modi, and this is not the first instance in which the Indians are using the arms of the state to go after their opponents. There is something happening in our democracies, or at least in some of our democracies, that has the feeling of the 1930s, in which organized violence and political violence seems to become an acceptable part, or at least a less objectionable part, or certainly not condemned enough part of the process. And so how worried should we be about that?
Well, I think we have to be very worried about the former president of the United States calling for people to be killed, whether the former head of the chiefs of staff. But I think the rise of populism, which doesn't respect the sort of institutional norms and doesn't share the sort of, norms for a lot of these populists are the property of elites, and they're of course against elites, so that allows them to discard these norms. So I think we have to be worried, but I think there is a way, even with these constraints, for governments have to deal with nasty regimes, but governments can actually set the terms on which they deal with those regimes. Now, we don't want a great breach with India. That leaders, the ones who aren't challenged at home, and that means my prime minister, your president, the French president, the German chancellor, have a chance. They have a pulpit. They can come out and say this is unacceptable. We won't have it, and they're not doing that. And they don't have an excuse, I think, for not doing that. It's not introducing sanctions against India. I think it's just calling it out. And I think that would have a big impact, because India cares about its international relationship. Modi cares. So if he's called out, it will have an impact.
Public shaming sometimes can work, Steve. It strikes me in this case, Philip has a good point.
Well, it does sometimes work. What is also part of what troubles me, in a way it's banal, but is this fascination of populism with these kind of muscular authoritarian leaders who somehow hide behind religion and nationalism and do whatever they want. I mean, Trump's fascination with Putin and Erdogan and Kim Jong-un is just typical of the way people respect power, power untrammeled by the norms of democracy and regulations. And this, I think, is troubling, because you almost have the sense that people are willing to dump those things that restrain our societies to feel somehow powerful in the world. And that's partly a social, psychological, political problem that seems to be growing to me, and I find deeply distressing personally.
Yeah, it does look like, Carla, last word to you, but it does look like that if Mussolini were still alive, he would be embraced by all too many people in our own societies these days.
And Biden ran promising that he was going to push back against that. He was going to. It wasn't, exporting democracy. It was clearly championing democracy and pushing back against authoritarianism. And he's got lots of opportunities to do this here because there are a lot of challenges. And we hope, and even if he gives the speech on Ukraine, that's sort of, he's got to focus on the domestic authoritarianism as well.
Well, we'll have to see whether he does, and whether people will take up the wisdom of the three of you in terms of figuring out how to deal with the problems that we face. I certainly hope we do, because the future is bleaker if we don't. I want to thank Carla Robbins, Philip Stevens, and Steve Erlanger for yet another excellent, insightful, somewhat gloomy, but then that's World Review for you. It's never not gloomy, for their insights. And I want to thank you all for tuning in this week for World Review. We'll be back next week with another edition. Until then, all have a wonderful weekend.